The world is holding its breath. Is the ghost of a trade war back? After returning to the White House in January 2025, the president is once again stoking old conflicts. On February 1, 2025, like a bolt from the blue, the introduction of a 10% duty on all goods imported from China was announced, starting on February 4, 2025. The administration explained this step as necessary to protect national security and combat unfair trade practices by China. The response was not long in coming. On February 10, 2025, China announced the introduction of 15% tariffs on American coal and liquefied natural gas, as well as a 10% tariff on oil and agricultural machinery. Moreover, an antitrust investigation was launched against Google, and export controls were introduced on a number of metals, including tungsten, which only added fuel to the fire. The escalation reached its peak on February 27, 2025, when the doubling of duties on Chinese imports to 20% from March 4, 2025, was announced. These actions raised fears of a repeat of the trade war between the two largest economies in the world, reminiscent of the events of the first presidential term. In response to the protectionist measures of the Trump administration, Beijing struck a tangible blow to the American agricultural sector, announcing the introduction of new duties ranging from 10% to 15% on key agricultural goods from the United States. Products with a total trade volume estimated at $21 billion were targeted. The Chinese strike was aimed precisely. The target was goods that are of strategic importance to American farmers but are not indispensable for the Chinese market. In other words, Beijing chose those positions for which it has the opportunity to reorient itself to other suppliers. Although certain niche products, such as chicken feet, may continue to come from the United States, the main export positions, including soybeans, pork, and grain, will now face increased tariff barriers. In particular, a 15% duty has been established on such important goods as chicken, wheat, corn, and cotton. A 10% duty will apply to other products, such as sorghum, soybeans, pork, beef, aquatic products, fruits, vegetables, and dairy products. These measures are expected to take effect on March 10, 2025. However, there is a grace period until April 12 for goods en route at the time the new rules are introduced. In addition to raising tariffs, China went even further, suspending import licenses for the three largest American soy exporters, which became another painful jab for the American agricultural business. China is increasing pressure on American farmers, citing the detection of contaminants in soybean batches such as ergot and seed treatment substances, which limits access to American products to the Chinese market. At the same time, an anti-dumping investigation has been launched against American fiber optic products, in which American companies are accused of circumventing anti-dumping measures. Export and investment restrictions have been introduced against 25 American companies operating in strategically important sectors of defense technology. These measures are aimed both at curbing American business and at preventing the transfer of technologies that, according to the Chinese side, may threaten national security. In response to growing trade tensions and unpredictable U.S. policy, China is actively diversifying its sources of imports, seeking to reduce its dependence on the American market. Beijing is increasing economic cooperation with Canada, Europe, South America, and BRICS countries, seeking to ensure the stability of supplies of key goods and raw materials in the long term. In the context of changing global trade, Canada is taking decisive steps to reorient its energy flows towards China. This strategic turn has become particularly relevant after the United States introduced protectionist measures expressed in customs duties on imports of Canadian energy. Washington's decision to impose a 10% tariff on Canadian oil and gas starting in March 2025 prompted Canadian producers to seek alternative sales markets. In this situation, China naturally came to the fore as a promising trading partner, and both countries are actively working to strengthen bilateral ties in the energy sector. One of the key events contributing to this reorientation was the completion in May 2024 of a large-scale expansion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, TMX. This ambitious project has significantly increased Canada's export capacity for crude oil from the Pacific coast. The pipeline's throughput capacity has almost tripled, reaching 890,000 barrels per day compared to the previous 300,000. Thanks to the TMX expansion, Canada has gained more direct and efficient access to Asian markets, reducing its dependence on U.S. pipeline infrastructure and refineries. This strategic move opens new horizons for the Canadian energy industry and promotes diversification of export destinations. The Canadian Trans Mountain Pipeline (TMX) project, once seen as a cornerstone of national energy policy, is now taking on a new, equally significant role ensuring the diversification of markets for Canadian oil. China is at the forefront of this shift, demonstrating a steadily growing appetite for the hydrocarbon resources of the Maple Leaf Country. Between May and November 2024, the People's Republic imported nearly 2.03 billion Canadian dollars worth of crude oil from Canada. This impressive surge in purchase volumes stands in stark contrast to previous years, indicating a fundamental reorientation of export flows. More than half of all crude oil transported through the TMX pipeline during this period found its consumer in China. This surge in Chinese demand for Canadian oil clearly demonstrates the strategic changes in Canada's energy trade. Major Chinese energy companies, including Rongsheng Petrochemical, are increasingly asserting themselves as key players in this market. This shift is driven by China's need for stable energy supplies, especially amid the turbulence that has gripped the global market. In addition, China seeks to diversify its sources of supply, reducing its dependence on traditional suppliers from the Middle East and Russia. The strengthening of energy ties between Canada and China also reflects broader geopolitical and economic trends. The mutual interest in energy cooperation opens new horizons for both countries, helping to strengthen their positions on the world stage. In Kitimat, British Columbia, Canada, a large-scale LNG Canada project is underway to create a liquefied natural gas production terminal. This ambitious project, implemented by a consortium that includes giants such as Shell and PetroChina, opens new horizons for Canadian energy exports to China. The terminal is expected to begin operations in 2025, providing initial exports of 14 million tons of LNG per year. In the future, there are plans to increase this capacity to 26 million tons, which will further strengthen China's position as a key consumer of Canadian energy resources. This project is designed to diversify China's LNG supply sources, helping to meet the country's growing demand for this fuel. In addition to developing production infrastructure, Canada is actively establishing direct trade links with China. In November 2024, delegations of Canadian Indigenous peoples visited China on trade missions seeking to establish long-term partnerships in the energy sector. These initiatives, supported by organizations such as the Canada-China Business Council, reflect a desire to ensure the participation and benefit of Indigenous communities in Canada's growing role as an energy exporter to Asia. In a rapidly changing global trade environment, Canada appears poised to further strengthen energy cooperation with China as U.S. tariffs create obstacles to traditional energy supply routes. Canadian investment in pipeline infrastructure development and increased liquefied natural gas (LNG) capacity, combined with growing demand from China, offer opportunities to diversify and enhance the resilience of the country's export strategy. China, seeking to diversify its sources of supply and reduce its dependence on American products, is increasingly turning to the European market for meat imports, particularly pork. This trend is driven by ongoing tensions in trade relations between China and the United States, with China imposing tariffs and restrictions on imports of American agricultural products in response to U.S. trade policies. As a result, Chinese importers are likely to significantly increase purchases of pork and other meat products from European Union countries, especially from major suppliers such as Spain and the Netherlands. Amid global trade upheavals, European meat is increasingly gaining ground in the Chinese market, offering a reliable alternative to American supplies. The impeccable reputation of European products, backed by the strictest safety standards and streamlined logistics, makes them increasingly popular among Chinese consumers. European pork producers, in particular, have become key players in this strategically important market. Thanks to its advanced processing capabilities and proactive government support for exports, Spain has managed to achieve a dominant position. The Netherlands, with its efficient farming methods and well-developed trade infrastructure, also firmly maintains its status as one of the leading pork suppliers to China. In addition to pork, China is showing increasing interest in other types of European meat, including beef and poultry. This move is part of a large-scale strategy to diversify food sources and reduce risks associated with potential trade conflicts. In its quest to ensure national food security, China is actively expanding its circle of foreign partners, and Europe is playing an increasingly prominent role in this process. The European meat industry is experiencing a period of significant growth driven by the growing appetite of the global market, especially in China. Investments in production and processing facilities in Europe are increasing as exporters seek to gain a foothold in the Chinese market. Amid uncertainty in trade relations between the U.S. and China, European meat producers see a unique opportunity to become the main suppliers to the Middle Kingdom. This maneuver reflects global changes in trade flows, highlighting the increasing role of the European Union in meeting China's growing demand for high-quality meat products. China, in turn, is actively seeking alternative suppliers to reduce its dependence on the United States. Escalating tariffs, supply chain disruptions, and geopolitical tensions are causing China to view the U.S. as a less reliable trading partner. In an era of increasing tension on global trade routes, triggered in part by recent protectionist measures by the United States against Chinese products, the People's Republic of China has stepped up its efforts to strengthen economic ties with South American nations and countries belonging to the BRICS association. In this new geo-economic configuration, the South American continent plays the role of one of the key beneficiaries of China's diversification strategy, having become a major supplier of agricultural products and mineral raw materials for the needs of the Middle Kingdom. During 2023, trade between China and Latin American countries, including the Caribbean, reached an impressive $489 billion. At the same time, Chinese imports from this region amounted to $243 billion, demonstrating strong growth of 4.9% compared to the previous year. The structure of these imports is characterized by a predominance of raw materials. About 70% of all goods shipped from Latin America to China are soybeans, crude oil, and copper. Notably, 90% of this export flow is provided by 4 countries: Brazil, Chile, Peru, and Venezuela. These countries have strengthened their trade ties with China as demand for their natural resources continues to grow steadily, fueling the economic rise of the Asian giant. The economic interaction between China and Brazil, a key partner in the South American region, demonstrates impressive dynamics. Bilateral trade reached $165.7 billion in 2022, which is 8.1% higher than the previous year. It is noteworthy that China has significantly increased purchases of Brazilian soybeans, a strategically important commodity that was previously imported in significant quantities from the United States. The start of the trade confrontation between the U.S. and China in 2018 was a turning point, prompting Beijing to reorient itself towards Brazil as its main supplier. By 2023, Brazilian soybean exports to China had reached an impressive share, exceeding 60% of the total volume of soybean imports into the Middle Kingdom. This maneuver underscores China's consistent strategy aimed at reducing its dependence on American agricultural products. In addition to the agricultural sector, China is actively diversifying its sources of energy imports. In 2024, crude oil supplies from Russia to China reached 108.5 million metric tons, up 1% from the previous year, strengthening Russia's position as the leading energy supplier for the Chinese economy. The People's Republic of China is actively diversifying its sources of liquefied natural gas, increasing imports from Qatar, Australia, and Canada. This move is aimed at reducing dependence on American energy resources and is part of a large-scale economic diversification strategy in which special emphasis is placed on strengthening ties with BRICS countries. In the first quarter of 2024, trade between China and BRICS member states reached an impressive 1.49 trillion yuan, indicating a significant increase of 11.3% compared to the previous year. As part of this consolidation, China is strengthening economic ties with India and South Africa, especially in key sectors such as energy, automotive, and machinery. As the BRICS bloc promotes trade mechanisms alternative to the US dollar, China is increasingly shifting to settlements in national currencies, further isolating its economy from US financial influence. A long history of trade disputes between the US and China has set the stage for these changes. These disputes have gradually pushed Beijing to reduce its dependence on American agricultural products, another significant step in its economic independence strategy. In response to the initial tariff battles during the Trump administration, China took steps to reduce its reliance on the American market. Starting in 2018, when Beijing imposed high tariffs on American soybeans, beef, pork, wheat, and corn, exports from the U.S. to China began to decline steadily. U.S. agricultural shipments stopped breaking records as China shifted its focus to other suppliers such as Brazil and Argentina. Early signs of change emerged as Chinese importers began purchasing more soybeans from Brazil. The United States' share of this market fell from 40% in 2016 to 18% in early 2024, while Brazilian soybeans, in contrast, increased their share from 46% to 74%. This was facilitated by competitive prices, favorable weather conditions, and the weakening of the Brazilian real. The recent increase in tariffs by the United States, raising duties on American goods from China to 20% and imposing 25% tariffs on imports from Canada and Mexico, did not go unanswered. Beijing responded quickly and with precision. There is a targeted effort to reduce the dependence of China's food supply on the American market and to strengthen alternative trade routes. This strategic maneuver by China, aimed at reducing agricultural imports from the U.S., has far-reaching consequences for American farmers, global trade, and geopolitical alliances in the long term. As China actively expands its circle of suppliers, the impact on the United States agricultural sector becomes increasingly significant, creating a domino effect in international markets. Despite ongoing tensions in trade relations, China remains the largest consumer of American agricultural products, importing approximately $29.25 billion worth of goods in 2024. However, Beijing's decision to raise tariffs on American agricultural products, combined with targeted efforts to develop alternative trade links, puts American farmers in a vulnerable position. Economic battles between Washington and Beijing have previously resulted in tangible losses for American exporters amounting to billions of dollars. These clashes have been particularly painful for producers of soybeans, pork, and dairy products whose supplies to the Chinese market have been affected. If the current trend continues, American farmers face a sustained decline in export revenues, which will significantly weaken their competitive position against new suppliers favored by China. In this situation, American agricultural exporters need to fundamentally rethink their trade strategies. Given the decline in demand from China, U.S. producers may need to reorient themselves towards new markets in Southeast Asia, Africa, and India to offset losses. However, entering these markets involves significant challenges related to logistics and the economic characteristics of these regions. The low purchasing power of the population in these countries will require American companies to develop new approaches to pricing and marketing. A flexible and adaptable supply system will be required to meet constantly changing market demands. It may be necessary to create fundamentally new distribution channels, revise existing trade agreements, and implement innovative approaches to production. That brings us to the end of today's broadcast. Thank you for being with us. Your attention and interest in our work are the greatest reward for us. If you find our materials useful, interesting, or inspiring, be sure to show your support by liking and subscribing to our channel. This will help you stay up to date with our latest publications and join our growing community. Your support is invaluable to us. And right now, a recommended video from our channel that may interest you will appear on your screen. Don't miss the opportunity to learn something new and